The Chicago Bears haven't made any big splashes around Justin Fields just yet, but the team is still interested in reportedly looking at some bigger name, notable free agents, and the rookie quarterback, now second-year quarterback, is proving to be an attractive selling point for potential free agents.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. On the show today, we check in and hear from the two first offensive free agent signings for the Chicago Bears. First, wide receiver Byron Pringle. We'll kind of talk about his fit in this Bears offense, where he sees his skill set helping out Justin Fields, and how those two sort of plan to work together to accentuate some of the things that Justin Fields does well as why he is so excited to play with Justin Fields and be a part of this team, and how that all sort of fits in this wide receiving core. Then we'll turn our attention to this Bears offensive line with Lucas Patrick coming in. We now know for sure which position he's going to play, and so from there we can move forward at looking at the rest of this Bears offensive line and how the other pieces then fit into place, and where they still have a hole that they're going to need to fill either in free agency or I guess through the NFL draft if they go in with that big of a potential need there. We'll wrap up with looking at some of the other guys the Bears have been reportedly interested in. A big name wide receiver. There's a lesser known offensive lineman coming in for a visit, and we'll kind of look at what is still out there to fill those holes in terms of building around Justin Fields, particularly on that offensive side of the ball. The Bears have been linked to some of the top wide receivers, or at least there's been some links, some speculation, a little bit of mix of both on some of these different options available. We'll get to one of them in particular that was firmly reported and interest in, but instead they start with Byron Pringle, right, on the one-year deal. And we broke down his game a little bit when the signing was first announced, but now we got to finally hear from him a little bit and kind of get a sense of why he came to Chicago, what attracted him here, how he sort of sees himself fitting in here, and who he is as a person. Because I think we can quickly get the sense that he is the type of receiver that Ryan Poles wants, right? He fits not only the physical skill set of size and speed, but also the type of person and type of player in terms of the mentality and the way he carries himself on and off the field. And I thought it was a good sort of peek into who Byron Pringle is beyond just what we could see in stats and of course on tape.
Byron, obviously Ryan Poles got to know you as a player really well in Kansas City. What do you think he saw in you that made you a fit for what the Bears are trying to build here?
Somebody that will come to work every day, ready to compete at a high level, and just have that mentality, that want-to-know mentality. I'm coming to win. I don't care about no numbers. I want that letter at the end of the game, that W.
Next question, Pat Finley.
Byron, you were playing with Patrick Mahomes, who's at the very, very high end of quarterbacks. What role did quarterback play in deciding where you wanted to go next, and what specifically grabbed you about Justin Fields?
Oh, man. Justin Fields, I've seen him here, an elite quarterback. He keep his legs alive. He definitely know how to extend plays, and that's something that I did in Kansas City. When the play broke down, I always try to get in the quarterback vision. So with him being able to keep play drives alive, I know I fit perfect in this offense, especially with a quarterback like Justin Fields.
You have to love, and I imagine Ryan Poles loved sort of the beginning answer there about he cares much more about wins than stats, right? He's not a wide receiver that's going to necessarily be upset if he's not getting enough targets. He's probably used to that a little bit from the Kansas City offense, although he's stepping into a potentially bigger role here with the Chicago Bears. But clearly, if they're winning, that's what matters the most to him, and that's what the big thing that Ryan Poles has been really emphasizing from the top down the entire time. We know Byron Pringle is big, and we know Byron Pringle is fast, but I thought he made a good point there about his connection with Patrick Mahomes, specifically on the scramble drill situations, right? When the play breaks down and Justin Fields has to get out of the pocket and receivers have already run their routes. There's not really more route to run. They just have to get open because they know Justin is running for his life. The pressure will be pending down soon, right? He doesn't have all day to just stand there and throw it, or maybe he'll scramble past the line of scrimmage. But regardless, the outcome is to just get open. And obviously, like, he had a lot of success with Patrick Mahomes in that type of a role, and Justin Fields is not going to be Patrick Mahomes, at least not this year, and probably not. I mean, that's not a realistic bar to set for Justin Fields. But the fact that Pringle has a lot of experience working in those types of situations with a big-armed quarterback that can extend plays should bode well for building that connection with Justin Fields. It's not something they can build overnight. It's going to take time to understand, okay, how fast my receiver runs, what ways he tries to get open in those situations. Is he always coming back to the ball? Can I direct him across the field? All those different things. But the more time they can spend together, the more time they can start to iron some of those things out. Ideally, it's not a major part of the Chicago Bears offense, right? Because in those situations, the play is already broken down, and you would like, ideally, for the play design to work first, the protection and the routes, to have a receiver get open and get the ball to them. But in those sort of, I don't know if you call it worst case scenario, but in those times when it doesn't work out the way it's supposed to, they have the quarterback that's capable of doing some of those types of things and a wide receiver who is capable of also doing some of those things. And of course, really excited to be working with Justin Fields on the Chicago Bears, which is always a plus in terms of free agents seeming to want to play with him. Offensive lineman Lucas Patrick said something similar in his press conference about Justin Fields, and that's a big part of this process too, right? Not only having receivers that can get open, but offensive linemen that can give Justin Fields more of that time to throw. We'll learn a little bit more about where Lucas Patrick fits in this Chicago Bears offensive line and what's left to do from there next on Locked On Bears. This college basketball tournament has had no shortage of madness, and it's been even more exciting and fun when you have a little bit of money laid down with our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and infos. We're talking scores, podcasts, news, everything you need to know with all the latest odds, contests, and player props. And it's not just the March basketball tournament, right? That's so much more fun. But plus, you can get NFL draft prop bets, plus all the sports. Baseball season right around the corner, hockey season right at the trade deadline, soccer, boxing, tennis, UFC, even your favorite Vegas casino games online, all through BetOnline. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. This Chicago Bears offensive line is going to start with Lucas Patrick as the center, the man in the middle. He kind of confirmed that, yes, that's where the team envisions him playing and essentially now directly usurps Sam Mustipher as the starting center. Mustipher brought back as an exclusive rights free agent, essentially a really, really cheap deal that they're automatically allowed to give him with no competition for him to sign anywhere else. And so he comes back, but doesn't come back handed the starting job, right? It was clear that they were going to need to upgrade that position, and Lucas Patrick played better last season than Sam Mustipher did. The question is, I think, how much of an upgrade? How much better? He will be better, but how much better will he be? Because he hasn't been a consistent, like, every week starter. The Packers haven't gone out of their way to leave him in a spot. He's been that swing guard / center that is filled in very well at both guard and center. But they drafted a center, Josh Myers, for a reason, because they didn't feel like maybe Lucas Patrick was the guy they fully wanted to be purely their go-ahead starting center with no other potential competition there. So maybe Sam Mustipher will also get a potential shot here. But it does raise some other questions about how the rest of the offensive line is going to fit together. But first, I want to hear from new center Lucas Patrick about sort of, again, where he sees himself fitting in Chicago, why he wants to be here, and the type of offensive lineman the Bears are going to get.
Do you have any indication yet whether they want you to start out focusing at center or guard?
Center. That's where I think I'll be. But there's one thing I've learned in the NFL is be ready to play any position, and that's definitely one thing I'll bring to this team is availability and reliability at multiple positions.
Talk that you're at your best at center. What do you think of that assessment, and why so? If that's something you agree with.
I think it's two things. I get to apply some of my mental strengths and kind of how I approach the game and how I see things, along with the physical approach that I can bring kind of right at the apex of the offensive line. When you combine those two, I think you can play a certain way, and that allows me to play football how I think it should be intended, which is physical, tough, but smart.
Again, talk about fitting exactly the mold Ryan Poles is looking for from an offensive lineman, a free agent, as a former offensive lineman himself, a former interior offensive lineman, playing the same position as Lucas Patrick. I sort of give him even a little bit more credibility evaluating that position, right? And give him even a stronger benefit of the doubt that a player at the same position he played seems more likely than even any other position to be a spot-on evaluation from Ryan Poles, you would think, given his experience at that spot. And that was one of the things, that was one of the things that Lucas Patrick talked about, right? Of having a guy who's truly has been through it in the exact same ways that you have. And so I think there's a real value there coming to Lucas Patrick. But then it's like, okay, he slots in at the starting center job. You've got Cody Whitehair for sure at left guard. And I think right now that's all we can kind of say for sure. If you look at the depth chart, right, immediately as of this very moment, Tevin Jenkins would be your starting left tackle. And then would Larry Borum be your starting right tackle or your starting right guard? That's a question I don't know that we have a firm answer to. And maybe the Bears don't have a firm answer to just yet. That Ryan Poles has said he wants this offensive line to be a little bit lighter and a little bit more mobile than they were the previous season, lose some weight in there. And Larry Borum is a bigger, heavier right tackle. It's why many draft analysts projected him inside to guard when he moved to the NFL, but the Bears let him play tackle first and played particularly well there, for at least for a fifth-round pick. But the question is, would the Bears prefer a more mobile, agile offensive tackle at that spot? Because Borum's perhaps lack of speed and mobility comparatively to other offensive tackles is less of a burden or less of a barrier at guard, right? At guard, you have less ground you need to cover, both in the running game and in the passing game. When you talk about the outside zone scheme that the Chicago Bears are going to run, they still want a mobile, agile guard, but comparatively to other guards, Borum is going to seem more fast than how he is compared to other offensive tackles who are going to just be faster and better in space, perhaps, than Larry Borum. So I think the Bears are sitting in a good place right now in terms of flexibility. They still need more talent, but they do have flexibility to where, potentially they could look at an offensive tackle and maybe a left tackle and put Tevin Jenkins at right tackle and kick Larry Borum inside. They could look at a right tackle and kick Larry Borum inside and leave Tevin Jenkins at left tackle, or they could sign a right guard and leave Larry Borum at tackle and have your two rookies be your tackles again moving forward. All of that is still, more or less contingent on actually signing a guy. But yeah, I guess I wonder, could Sam Mustipher get a look at guard? He seemed a little bit undersized and I don't want to say weak. He's a very strong man. He's stronger than any of us and could kick our butts, but comparatively, maybe not as strong in terms of anchoring and taking on pass rushers as some other centers. And I wonder if it would be even more potentially exposed at right guard. But right now the Bears just don't have other real options. They have Dieter Iselin as a backup center / guard who was an undrafted free agent a couple years ago who's barely played. They have Latavius Simmons as a 7th-round pick who was played in emergency situations and didn't do particularly well. And it's a lot of those Tyrone Wheatley, Willie Wright type players that just are kind of journeyman nobodies. So they're going to have to bring in somebody else on this offensive line. They're going to have to add potentially another starting caliber player. And ideally, you do it before the NFL draft. So you don't go into the NFL draft saying, I have to draft a week 1 starting offensive lineman, because that's what leads you to then reaching on certain prospects, trying to force one into a slot where maybe it's too early for them or it's not good value, and maybe you overdraft the player because you're so desperate to get a player at that position, and all of a sudden you don't build your team necessarily the way that you'd like to. You want to get talent in the draft and fill holes in free agency. The Bears still have one of those on the offensive line. They still have quite a few of them, I think, across the roster that still need to be addressed. Still very early in free agency, and they're still actively working on a lot of different names out there. We've heard some concrete reporting on a few individuals, and of course, Bears fans have speculated about pretty much every possible free agent under the sun here, but we'll take a closer look at the guys the Bears have shown real interest in and some of the other guys available that maybe they should show real interest in next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at rockauto.com. They've got the web's largest selection of auto parts anywhere you can find. Their catalog is so incredibly deep. It has car parts that I don't understand exactly what they do, but I know they're important, like engine control modules and fuel pump assemblies. But they got the easy stuff too, like tail lamps, motor oil, new carpets, stuff that I feel more comfortable putting in. But I know that if I need a quality auto part at a good price, I'm very comfortable going to rockauto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers for over 20 years. They're actually based not far from where I live, and they've been sort of a brand in my life for my entire life, ever since I was a kid. I've always kind of known rockauto.com, and I'm glad they're supporting us here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Because some part stores, especially like the chains, they'll have a different price tier for professional mechanics who get cheaper deals than do-it-yourselfers like us who just walk into the store. But rockauto.com's prices are the same for everybody. So don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Head on over to rockauto.com today and see all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, fill in their box that says, "How did you hear about us?" and write in the words "Locked On" so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. The Chicago Bears still need a few more parts for really both sides of the ball, and they're still looking at potentially some big name parts and some lesser name parts. Obviously, the strategy so far has been cheaper, younger free agents on affordable short-term contracts, bring them in, try them out for a year, maybe two, and then if they play really well, give them a contract extension and make them a long-term part of your team. And if they don't play very well, then you don't pay them and you're not out a bunch of money and you didn't really have much risk invested in them in the first place. But even after the Ogunjobi signing and then the Ogunjobi failed physical, the Bears are still looking at least at some bigger, and by bigger I mean like more expensive type options. Because I was a little bit surprised to read the reporting, and it's not just speculation, but reported from insiders that the Chicago Bears were interested and pursued a trade for Los Angeles Rams wide receiver Robert Woods. He, of course, is coming off of an injury, not expected to be really ready to go until, certainly not by week 1, but midway through the season, November, December, October. It's still sort of to be determined, but you would be getting an asset, and I guess the Tennessee Titans got the asset that is damaged goods at least the very beginning. And the Tennessee Titans gave up, was it a 5th-round pick to trade for Robert Woods? And a lot of fan bases of other teams were saying, well, why didn't my team trade a 5th-round pick for that good of a wide receiver? We can wait for the injuries, especially in Chicago, right? They're not all in on the Super Bowl this year. They want to win games, but they want to build around Justin Fields and get the right pieces in place. So it's not like they would be devastated if they struggled without Robert Woods for the first half of the season. He would be more for that longer-term building around Fields and building that chemistry for really like the following season. Robert Woods' current salary cap hit, $13.5 million. Pretty close to the average salary that the Bears were going to pay Larry Ogunjobi, but surprising, right, that they were trying to trade for potentially a wide receiver of that caliber and of that price tag when the motto or the mold everywhere else has been cheaper, younger, short-term type deals. They do have other potential free agent wide receivers available. They were interested in Marquez Valdez-Scantling. It sounds like that has gotten into more of a potential bidding war. The Packers trying to bring him back. A number of other teams reportedly interested in his services. So I wouldn't expect the Bears to want to bid up all the way on Valdez-Scantling after they signed his teammate Equanimeous St. Brown to go with Byron Pringle. But right now you got Mooney Pringle and Equanimeous St. Brown, and you feel like you just need like one more option there. I wouldn't expect like Odell Beckham Jr. to really be in that conversation given his ACL injury, and plus I don't think he would want to necessarily come to the type of window that Chicago's in right now. He's looking more like to win more Super Bowls. But like Will Fuller, as another one of these potential deep threats. Not really a true number one, right? I don't know if the Bears are going to find one of those on the free agent market, but more in that affordable range. Like, I don't know if Jarvis Landry would be considered an option for them, if he would be considering Chicago, if he's going to be priced out for them a little bit too much, or again, if he's going to be looking for more of a true, like, ready-to-win now team as opposed to coming into Chicago and kind of biding your time for the first season and just trying to build that chemistry with Justin Fields. But then, there's a lot of, like, other veteran free agent receivers that are just kind of sitting out there that don't really fit the Bears. Like, they're not going to sign a 33-year-old A.J. Green or a 35-year-old Deshaun Watson or a 32-year-old T.Y. Hilton, right? Some of these aging veterans just don't really seem to fit exactly where the Bears are, so it becomes a little bit more tricky to, like, find exactly who's going to be the right fit for this organization, and seems more like maybe the NFL draft might be the way to go there. Again, you don't want to feel like you have to take one with your first few picks, but, like, it's going to be a better crop of NFL draft prospects than free agents. The Bears also now formally meeting with a free agent offensive lineman. Brad Biggs reported, I think last night, that former Buffalo Bills guard Ryan Bates is coming in today, Tuesday, as this podcast is coming out, for a meeting with the Bears. He met with the Minnesota Vikings, I think, yesterday, Monday, and then, of course, he is a restricted free agent. So the Bills have tendered him a one-year contract, and they have the right to match any potential contract he might sign with another team. And clearly, I think he's just trying to find which of these interested teams will give him the biggest contract, and he wins either way if the Bills match it or if he goes on to one of these other organizations. Bates has really made his first, like, actual starting type role at the end of this season, filling in for injury. He started in week 16 and through the playoffs for the Bills at left guard. Otherwise was an undrafted free agent out of Penn State in 2019, started with the Eagles, was actually traded to the Bills and spent the last two seasons, as a part of their roster and kind of filling in as a backup at special teams on field goals and all that stuff, but more in this mold of, like, the Lucas Patrick type offensive lineman. Not a bona fide, clear-cut NFL starter, but someone that you bring in who's young, potentially still ascending, developing, and he could compete at right guard, right? Whether it's with Larry Borum or with another rookie or however the Bears end up moving their pieces around, Ryan Bates could sort of slot in right there, and maybe you put both your rookies back at offensive tackle, and that could be potentially your starting five. Again, Bates played pretty well late last season as a starter, but we're talking about a 5-game sample size? Yeah, 5-game sample size of starts for him this past season, so it's not necessarily like he's this gem diamond in the rough, and I wouldn't expect the Bears to pay top dollar for him. It's just a question of, like, can they offer him a little bit more than the Bills want to pay, or are the Bills really stuck on paying him and bringing him back, right? He was tendered as an original round free agent, which basically means that, like, any team that signs him would not have to give the Bills any draft compensation, like some of the other restricted free agents. If you put him at a first-round tender or a second-round tender, you would get that draft pick back from whatever team signs him. The Bills did not do that with Ryan Bates, so there wouldn't be any punishment to the Bears for signing him. It's just that the Bills get first right of refusal. We'll see what team Ryan Bates ultimately ends up picking and some of these other free agent receiver options, and the Bears still have a lot of work to do defensively. They need a safety. They need a cornerback. They might need another linebacker here, and they could even use more depth at defensive tackle. So there'll be plenty more free agent moves to talk about all offseason long right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, yesterday Locked On Blackhawks went live at the NHL trade deadline and kind of looked at, okay, where does the team go from here in the home stretch of the NHL season? Plus, the Locked On Bulls podcast is revamped and ready to go with a couple of great new hosts over there. Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day. I'll always be here for your Chicago Bears every single day, and I hope that in exchange or in return, that the Locked On Bears podcast helps you bear down.